Tēnā koto, ko Christian Shota ho, ko te herenga waka aho, tēnā koto katoa. So sorry, that's a very quick rehash of my brief mihi to welcome you to this webinar, and I should have checked my mute button. So welcome to this final webinar in our series of webinars hosted by the School of Management at Victoria University of Wellington. And it is about rethinking tourism. And it is our final seminar in that series. And rethinking tourism is important because the shock that we have experienced that's affected all sectors of the tourism world in New Zealand and elsewhere has, of course, left a huge trail of destruction, but also provides a platform for us to really rethink, reconsider where we want tourism to go. And in that framing, I would like to introduce our speakers today, which will talk broadly about how they would like to reimagine tourism. And in our series of webinars, we've had many different perspectives presented. And as a summary of today's webinar, I would say that it is very much a social element that will come through quite strongly from communities and the social aspect and element of tourism that is so important. So the session will be chaired by myself, and we will have three excellent speakers that are experts in their fields joining us from around the world. We have Dr. Freya Higgins-Desbiolles from the University of South Australia, and she will be talking about socializing tourism. And then we have Dr. Chris Paltrow, who's one of our alumni, and he will be talking about the future for human capital development, and he's joining us from Canada, from Capilano University in BC. And finally, we will have Professor Karen Smith, who is, of course, our Professor of Tourism Management here at Victoria, and she will be talking about cultivating tourism ambassadors. So welcome to all three speakers. It's a great pleasure to have you join us, particularly seeing that there are very different time zones involved. And I really look forward to bringing these three wonderful perspectives together that undoubtedly will lead to some interesting discussion, maybe even debate. Okay, so I would like to briefly introduce Freya before I hand over to her. Freya is a senior lecturer in tourism management in the business unit at the University of South Australia, and her work focuses on social justice issues in tourism, hospitality, and events. She has worked with communities, non-governmental organizations, and businesses that seek to harness tourism for human rights, justice, and equitable futures. Over to you, Freya.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really honored to be in this series where we've had such good speakers presenting ideas on what we might do to rethink tourism after COVID-19. So my name's Freya, and I'm speaking to you in Adelaide from Kaurna country. It's Kaurna land here, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country as a way of understanding the relationship between people in place and honoring the care that they've done for country over millennia. And the really important point to understand in this is about relatedness. My concept of socializing tourism, which I'm going to introduce to you today, is about this idea of relatedness, and with that comes responsibility and possibly an idea of reciprocity. And I also honor the Maori people of New Zealand as I'm speaking today, because Indigenous knowledges have helped shape some of the thinking of what I'm doing. I'd like to thank the people who have organized this, and this includes Christian for being the moderator and Ian for doing a lot of the footwork, as well as Colette and Abby for making these things happen. And the speakers that have gone before, particularly people like Anna Carr, who spoke in the last session and who really impressed me with their thinking. Christian, could you go to the next slide, please? So my question is, Why socialize? What is it that brought me to this thinking? And I'd like to note that in a 2018 survey in Hawaii, there was an item that surveyed the question, our islands are being run for tourists at the expense of locals. And this was in 2018 by the Hawaii Tourist Authority. So this alerts us to a problem with tourism, and that's really the context I'd like to situate this idea of why do we need to socialize tourism. So that's the presentation I'd like to do first, is just to lay this understanding that something's wrong with tourism and that we need to change it. So my images here include Venice at the top, and we do know some of the stories coming out of the places experiencing over-tourism about communities having grave problems with the imposition of tourism upon them. So in a place like Venice, you've seen things like the cruise ships and day trippers being accused of extracting from Venice and giving very little back, and in fact leaving negative impacts. I've also written about the cruise ships as one of the problems of tourism, with about 70 to 80% of that market being based on what I call exploitation. And I give an analysis of that the profit model is actually at the expense of the crew, who are not in good working conditions frequently in this mass model that I'm talking about. Secondly, there is use of the destinations with giving too little in return, and that's where some of the controversies come from. And thirdly, the environmental impacts that they have. The last example I'll give is the recent August 18th, 2020 statement by the UN World Tourism Organization, pushing for a restart of tourism and claiming it's no time for timid leadership. I was actually quite disappointed by this statement, particularly with the World Health Organization, a sister body of the UNWTO in the UN system, warning to be cautious as we face second waves. So what these things show me is that tourism is out of balance. And in fact, we emphasize tourism at the expense of societies in these cases. So that's the basis for my thinking on this. Christian, could you please go to the next slide? So what I'm arguing is tourism matters and it's worth struggling for. While we're in COVID, we know this because we've seen borders shut and tourism, hospitality, events, and arts and cultural industries shut down. And what it's done is it's shown us just how reliant we are on these industries for our jobs and our economic growth and our incomes. And so we're hearing some statements estimating there might be an 80% decline in international tourism as a result of COVID-19, that there's going to be a $1 trillion loss coming to tourism export revenues. And with this will come a loss of some 120 million jobs in tourism as a result of this. So this is grave. But I'd also like to point out that there's some things that we need to be thoughtful about. For instance, Bali, which is a tourism-dependent economy, is finding people really struggling. And so to me, this raises the question about tourism dependence. And there's been a talk about people returning to the rice fields and their family farms in this situation to try to survive. And of course, I'd like to ask why the cruise industry mistreated many of its crew labor in the crisis. Here in Australia, as we watch the Ruby Princess and these other stranded ships, there really was a pronounced lack of concern by the wider community and by governmental authorities, in my opinion, with some thousands of crew who were in grave difficulty as a result of this. Could I have the next slide, please? So in socializing tourism, I've used that word as a provocation, you know, in Australian and British and American politics. To call somebody a socialist is actually a pejorative term. So I'm using it as a provocation, but it's actually a very rich term to think about what socializing might mean. So from the dictionary, I've pulled these ideas about the idea of spending time with other people, the idea that we're socializing people to behave in a particular way that society considers good, and it could also mean provided for by the government. And all of these things challenge our thinking about what we might do. But I do want to note with COVID-19, what we've seen is a really important moment when we've seen that neoliberalism doesn't deliver what we need and the market doesn't deliver what we need. What we've returned to in this crisis is the idea of community and our societies and caring and well-being within this. So it gives us a really thought-provocative moment to ask, what do we want to do when we emerge from this situation? So could I have the next slide, please, Christian? What I'm calling socializing tourism is an effort to make tourism responsive and answerable to the society in which it occurs. This is based upon putting tourism in its proper place. And so going back to that UN statement, that UN WTO statement that it's no time for timid leadership, that's prioritizing tourism over the well-being of people and societies. So that's what's important about this definition that I'm offering. And tourism's proper place is at the service of the local community. Could you advance the slides, please, Christian? So with this, I've given a definition in some of my work, which moves away from a definition centered on the tourist or the tourism industry, and to emphasize the local community as the basis of tourism going forward. So in socializing tourism, what I'm proposing is we make the local community's rights, interests, needs, and benefits the center of tourism. And you can see in this model, and it's in my writing to look at more detail, that it then demands things of every other player in this, such as government supporting community interest in tourism, that the tourists come as guests and not as demanding customers, that the tourism industry changes its attitude to seek a social license to operate. Now, we do already have examples of this in our current situation. So for instance, Maori protocols of welcoming people to the marae actually socializes people in how to behave in a respectful way on the country, on the lands of Indigenous peoples. We have Leary tourism here in Arnhem Land in Northern Territory of Australia, which actually has a set of principles that says you come and you visit according to our principles. And it actually sets it out to say, tourism is not our priority. We welcome you as a visitor, but other things may take priority as a result of this. I also think New Zealand's Tiaki Promise is a great example of this, in that campaign of asking visitors to come as conscious custodians of the New Zealand beautiful environment, rather than as takers and receivers of the beauty of the country, that you actually are invited to be custodians. Could we move to the next slide, please? So when you look at this together, I'm proposing a process of how we might socialize tourism. It starts with that redefining tourism. And then what I'm asking for is that all public monies used for tourism go to tourism for the public good. And that's in a contrast to what I see at the moment, for instance, in national parks, where we're seeing privatization and private companies making profits off of our industry and actually being subsidized by the government to do that. So I'm not saying we get rid of commercial tourism, but what I am saying is that public monies promote tourism for the public good. And with that, then we socialize tourism to serve the local community. And what we might see is some things being fostered that have been overshadowed in recent years, such as tourism for education, things like school camps and exchanges, or citizen science and tourism for conservation. And we've also got exchanges and the regenerative work that can be done that we heard about in the last session that was offered here. So I've come to my end of my talk. My main statement is tourism serves the society, and that we need to change it and reset the agenda so that it does actually become a service to the communities in which it operates. And then we won't see these problems that I started out my talk with. I'm looking for collaborators in this work, and I hope that this talk has been interesting, because I invite people to join me on what should be an exciting reset agenda. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Freya. Thank you for that very interesting and very thought-provoking discussion. And I think it really resonates with a lot of feelings certainly in New Zealand and Australia, where also a lot of academics are having similar conversations as we look at resetting tourism. So thank you very much for kicking us off in this way. And I should point out that we have got the Q&A tab open. So please post your questions there. That would be preferred over the chat option, which is not monitored as much. And we will reserve the Q&A session right until the end, until all three speakers have had an opportunity to share their different insights and their research. So I would now like to focus on our second speaker, Dr. Chris Paltrow, and he will talk about the future for human capital development and tourism. Sorry, a topic also very close to my heart. And I would just like to briefly introduce Chris before I give him the stage. So Chris is, of course, a graduate of ours, and I don't know which is more important, that or the fact that he's the current elected chair of the Pacific Asia Travel Association. I think probably equal importance. And he is also the current director international at Kapilana University in Vancouver, BC, and the past dean of 3 different faculties overseeing schools of tourism, business, motion picture arts, outdoor recreation, human kinetics, and others. Wow, I'm interested in the human kinetics one. And he taught a wide array of tourism and management subjects in universities in Canada, New Zealand, USA, Austria, and has designed and facilitated 7 youth symposia with over 20 universities. So I think in summary, this is a really good introduction into why Chris talks about human capital development from his experience. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's a real pleasure to be here and participate today. I had the good pleasure of connecting with Ian Yeoman at the UNWTO Pāta Gwilin Forum just a couple of years ago. And so thank you for that, Ian. It was wonderful connecting, and to reconnect with the school again is terrific. A special hello to Doug Pierce, if you're out there. Doug's my supervisor for my master's, my PhD, my mentor. Thank you so much, Doug. I am a New Zealander. I'm a Canadian as well. And I'm speaking to you from Vancouver in the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Sechelt, Tsleil-Waututh, and Littlewood coastal Salish peoples here. So this presentation is designed to prompt some thoughts about the challenges that exist for us as educators, really, and the future of work in our industry, and the way that we need to educate as the future of work changes and our education models change so radically into the future. Next slide, please, Christian. So a little while ago, the WTTC conducted an analysis of talent trends. And in this, they suggested that in the major leading destinations of the planet, which actually were about 90% of travel on the planet, there's a talent deficit shortage of about 14 million people, and that equated to about $610 billion over the next 10 years. This, by the way, is about 105 times the box office sales of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and 2 Hobbit movies. So it's a decent chunk of change. And it was a pretty promising outlook for us all in the business. Next slide, please, Christian. But as we know, there is so much uncertainty ahead. Not only has the industry lost about 100 million jobs due to COVID-19, but automation and new technologies are replacing jobs and creating new ones, and we're just not entirely sure in what field or how many jobs those are. How do we figure all of this out? Next slide, please. The OECD has put some numbers on it, actually, and a 2019 report on the future of jobs estimates that 14% of jobs could be completely automated, this in general terms, and a further 32% likely to be significantly changed. That's half the jobs. So which ones are they, and how does this affect us in tourism? Next slide, please, Christian. In New Zealand, the trends were identified some time ago. Some interesting work has been done with data which really reflects the OECD numbers. What we know is that labourers, operators, clerical, administrative, sales fields are under really significant risk. There are many fields of work that fall into these categories in tourism, such as kitchen staff, hotel operations, drivers of vehicles, and so on. It was my first job in the industry, by the way, as a tour driver, as Doug knows. What is faring a little better are jobs with personal service attributes, which is good for tourism and managers and professionals, but it does beg the question of who are these managers and professionals supposed to manage? Robots, perhaps. Could have the next slide. In the jobs of the future, which are changing, we need to ask our question, are we teaching the right things? Will the jobs, such as the student here who's training at Hong Kong Polytechnic University's Hotel Icon, which is an incredible place, by the way, and a wonderful program run by Kate Chon. Will the student have a job when she graduates, or the 5 years after she graduates? Is a robot going to take her job? Next slide, please. The answer actually is that it already has. The one on the left there is a customer service robot that I met at Taipei Airport. And this provides flight information, directions, and so on. And it also asks you to hold its hand, and it will tell you your age. It told me I was 25, so I really liked this particular robot. But then I was in the Visitor Information Center in Copenhagen, and who should be there but that sneaky robot again, telling its lies and charming unsuspecting visitors like me, no doubt. I think here it's just telling this little boy, you know, the world of travel in the future will be fantastic. No concerns about anything like climate change, pandemics, nationalist protection, or anything like that. So these robots are being used for all kinds of purposes: retail, travel, hospitality, financial services, restaurants, healthcare, other customer-facing applications. And it's not the future, it's the present. According to the Robotic Industries Association, in 2018, sales of robots grew 53%. Customer service robots grew, robots general, grew 53%. And no, this is customer service robot, I'm sorry, grew 53% over previous year, which is about 7,000 units. In the next 2 years, they estimate 40,500 of these customer service robots will be sold, and nearly half of these will be in the Asia Pacific. So it's not quite filling the 14 million talent gap that WTT says, but certainly edging on the way towards it. A distinct value-added characteristic of these robots is that they are data collectors as well, and they can add information about you. Now, in terms of the data projections for New Zealand, the same patterns exist in the US, and as you can see in this data sheet from McKinsey & Company, 2016, a lot of the jobs are in automated or in areas which are traditional, or which are what we consider as traditional repetitive industries are going. And even in food and beverage and areas like that, and areas that we thought that there was a lot of customer service activity, those are going too. There's now fully automated hotels such as Flyzoo Hotel, which is Alibaba and a Marriott collaboration in China, which uses facial screening for elevators, accessing rooms and payments. The robots serve you, they clean the hotel, they make drinks, and various other things like that. In Nagasaki, Japan, Henna Hotel is a little more creepy, actually, and this one's fully run by robots. You can be checked in by a humanoid receptionist with a rubber face, or a dinosaur with a porter hat. They'll take the bags to your room, and the whole thing is cleaned and so on by Zumbas, which are at our houses, along with Alex's, Siri's, and Google, and so on already. In terms of data collection and data processing, we would have thought those areas were quite safe, but in fact, those are also changing as well. Dorchester Hotels, for example, has implemented an AI system which can read 7,000 reviews in a minute and pinpoint exactly what customers want. Next slide, please, Christian. I took this photo 2 years ago on a subway in Seoul in South Korea. As you might notice, no one is interacting with anybody else. This is not an unusual scene. It's a very common scene, of course. It's just their phones. If I could ask you if anybody knows when the iPhone was announced, it'd be interesting to know your answer. But just if you said it 13 years ago, you'd be right. January the 9th, 2007, just 13 years ago. In that time frame, everything has changed. And it's changed for the future of work, and with it the future of education. And how this applies to us, we're not sure yet. What's coming next is equally, if not certainly, if not equally, then certainly highly significant. Elon Musk's SpaceX and Starlink is already being launched with 11,000 satellites going into the sky. There are already 700. This will have easy online access for anyone around the world, and especially for emerging economies where we know the populations are large. This creates increased opportunities, but increased competition, changing jobs, and we have to ask ourselves the question, who's going to adapt the quickest? Next slide, please, Christian. Suddenly, in fact, amidst all this uncertainty and the difficulty that COVID-19 has presented, it's also thrown us into the future for education delivery. In a matter of 2 weeks, 1 billion people, a seventh of the planet, moved to online education. It's astounding that that happened. Normally, that would have taken years to implement. Next slide, please. Until then, some institutions were adapting, but they were not to the extent currently or the extent in the private sector. In the business community, there's long since figured out that people want to learn anytime, anywhere, and on their schedule. Now, this is QCO. It's a boutique organization, a member of PARTA actually, and it's a good example of one which is just catering directly to the business sector needs. But large tech companies have increasingly become involved in online delivery. Tencent just made major additional investments, and the industry is projected to reach 350 billion by 2025. Not before COVID-19 did we understand about Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and Blue Jeans, but we know all about it now. The changing education landscape is directly linked to this future of jobs and how we prepare for the next generation of the workforce. Managers are not sending anybody to university, night schools, or anything like that anymore. Those kinds of continuing education programs are not doing well in large part. They're not even sending the 4-year degrees in many cases. They're sending to lynda.com to get a skills upgrade, or maybe Udemy, which has 295 million course enrollments and teaches 50 million students around the world. Now, the fourth industrial revolution has brought these changes, and there is advice out there, and it's consistent advice in some cases. 10 skills that are suggested to survive in this world are complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, people management, coordination with others, judgment, decision making, service orientation. And what we do really well in our education spheres are these kinds of things, where we focus on cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal skill sets. This is the kind of thing that we do really well. But we are going to have to think about how to upskill in a very short time frame and give the kinds of skill sets that people need to excel in their fields. As one YouTuber, Tidal Wave, commented on the future jobs, with all the uncertainty, he had 3 suggestions. Focus on yourself and find out what it will take to succeed. Find out what you're good at and want to keep getting better at, and do it better at forever, and explore one thing that can be valuable to others. Not bad advice. With that foundation, then you skill from there. Now, tourism, as we know, there are really 3 things I want to suggest that we need to think about. We need to stop, in tourism education, we need to stop teaching courses that will be useless in 4 years and really think about the structure and length of our programs. We need to focus on how we think, interact with others, and communicate and collaborate, and apply this to different dynamic skill sets on an as-needed basis. And we need to figure out how to make sure that human interaction is going to be an essential component of our industry, and decide that a robot is not going to take the job over. The previous picture had a picture of a suitcase, and as one global leader mentioned, tourism has not had a particularly good reputation for being innovative. It took us 30 years to figure out, after humans had landed on the moon, that it was a good idea to put wheels on a suitcase. But as you see from the next slide, we are definitely getting better. So thank you for listening. I hope that was of interest. I hope it sparked some thought on the matter. Are we doing the right thing in education? Are we keeping pace? And what are we trying to keep pace with? Thanks very much, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. Sorry, I was taking you along a little bit with the slides because I think we were beginning to go over time a little bit. But thank you very much for that really thought-provoking discussion, because I have very similar thoughts about the future, well, even current education. It's not even the future of education anymore. There's something very profound that we need to look at, particularly if we take on board what Freya talked about, and then if we take on board what Karen will talk about. All of this has significant implications for our education. So on that note, I would like to now introduce Professor Karen Smith, and she will talk about cultivating tourism ambassadors in our communities. And Karen is Professor of Tourism Management and Associate Dean for Learning and Teaching at Wellington School of Business and Government at Te Herenga Waka. And her research focuses on people and work and tourism and events and volunteer management across a range of sectors. And we are proud to say that in 2019, she was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to volunteering and education. And she's also the currently the first vice chair of COFI, who will be what will be familiar to many of you as the Council for Australasian Tourism and Hospitality Education. And I would now like to hand over to.
Thank you, Christian, and kia ora koutou, everyone. Thanks to Ian and the team for putting together this really interesting webinar series and inviting me to speak today. It's been really great to come third here, because I'd like to pick up on some of the themes that we've heard in Freya and Chris's presentations. But I'm going to bring you back to New Zealand, and I'm going to take an unashamedly New Zealand focus to argue today that the reimagining of tourism, we have a vital opportunity to better cultivate our communities as supporters and ambassadors for tourism. As we've already heard today, and we know more broadly, the impacts of the global pandemic have had massive economic impacts on tourism. We've seen massively reduced tourism numbers, job losses, business closures, destinations reopening only to lock down again, and so on. And we've heard some different statistics. The one I picked out was the World Travel and Tourism Council, who back in June were forecasting more than 197 million travel and tourism jobs globally being lost to prolonged travel restrictions. But I think that what I want to emphasize today, that impacts are not just about the numbers, they're actually about the people. So those business closures and retrenching are the product of years of investment and commitment by the owners, investors and staff. The reduced hours and job losses are the product of people losing their income, livelihood, and often a key part of their identity in their community. This impacts on their families economically and socially through reduced incomes and well-being, but it also impacts on the communities in where they live, especially in regional areas heavily dependent on tourism. So I'd like to go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Christian. And talk about how in recent years, we've heard an increasing use of the phrase social license to operate. And in fact, Freya's already mentioned it today. And I want to use it to think about how we can reimagine tourism. So writing in Policy Quarterly in 2018, Kevin Jenkins in a New Zealand context talks about how social license to operate concept originated in the mining sector, but has been adopted more widely in various industries, including tourism. Now, partly this has been a reaction to communities' experience or at least perceiving the negative impacts of tourism. And so that might be in New Zealand from things like freedom camping, overseas drivers, crowding, and so on. But the threat to the tourism social license to operate has also been linked to the rapid growth of tourism and inadequate responses to managing that growth. However, the turn towards thinking about social license to operate has also been proactive in a strategic direction. And here I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of the tourism industry Aotearoa in this regard. So for example, in their Tourism 2025 and Beyond document, they talk about the importance of managing tourism and growth and ensuring that New Zealanders continue to offer manaakitanga, or respect and welcome, to our visitors. And they talk about how industry social license to operate is intangible, but it's a very real asset that we need to measure and manage. We also see this in the New Zealand Tourism Sustainable Commitment, which I think is a world-leading example of how we can put different aspects of sustainability together. And here we're placing host community sustainability alongside economic, environmental and visitor commitments. And alongside the sustainability commitment comes industry goals. So for example, New Zealand is happy with the level of tourism activity and support growth, and tourism businesses are desirable and responsible employers and leaders in engaging and supporting vibrant communities. Now, of course, next slide, please, Christian. So in doing this, I'll be thinking about how rethinking tourism and its social license to operate. I want to think about communities as tourism ambassadors, because actually those businesses and those individuals in our communities aren't just working and taking part in tourism. They're already active participants in their communities. So we think of, for example, tourism businesses who are huge parts of their communities in terms of sponsoring local sports teams and clubs, donating funds in kind and support for charities and good causes. They're part of the communities that they live in, because these tourism owners, investors and staff are also their community civic leaders, volunteers and all-round good sorts. So what I want to do now is think about 4 ways we can continue to get communities on side with tourism and further cultivate them as ambassadors for our sector rather than just as critics. So next slide, please, Christian. So first I want to think about our communities as domestic tourists. So domestic tourism has been recognised as a key component of the short-term recovery, both here in New Zealand, but we're also seeing similar trends overseas. While we've seen visitors in leading tourism destinations such as Queenstown, there's also been a push for New Zealanders to discover new places and experience beyond their usual school holiday hotspots. This will hopefully give New Zealanders a deeper insight into the role that tourism plays in our communities, and we hope support the industry's social licence to operate. We've long recognised the importance of word of mouth in generating new and repeat visits, and as New Zealanders freshly discover their own backyard, we need to deliver those outstanding visitor experiences so that Kiwis become ambassadors for what New Zealand has to offer, not just to share with their neighbours back home, but also longer term to international visitors once borders start to reopen. VFR, visiting friends and relatives, has always been an important part of our international arrivals, and the impact of border restrictions has perhaps been particularly hard felt on families who are separated. When borders start to open, it's likely this will be at a significant cost, both financially and time-wise. And the ongoing of travel in a post-COVID world may well mean that reuniting family and friends will play a significant role in the re-emergence of international travel. We need New Zealand citizens and residents to be ambassadors when they welcome their friends in whānau, and to be sharing their outstanding experiences that they have had of local travel, and to be ambassadors for our tourism regions and start to rebuild these tourism communities. But it's not just as tourists that we need to get New Zealanders on side. Next slide, please, Christian. Communities can also be ambassadors in other ways. And I'll start by first talking about volunteering in tourism. So when people link tourism and volunteering, they typically think about volunteer tourism or perhaps voluntourism, people travelling to volunteer. Now, although this is not a sector without its challenges, volunteer tourism can be a really valuable way for New Zealanders and potentially eventually international tourists to get more deeply involved and contribute to the destinations they're visiting. Right now, we can be identifying and promoting opportunities for Kiwis to lend a hand and to contribute to the environments and communities that as part of domestic tourism experiences. Now, this needs to be done really well to ensure that neither the volunteer tourists nor the communities are exploited, but there is huge potential to grow this aspect of domestic tourism. But I also want to highlight another way that volunteers can be ambassadors for tourism, by volunteering in their own community to enhance the experience of visitors. We see this in the thousands of Kiwis who volunteer in conservation and heritage organisations, for example. And while supporting tourism might not be their motivation for volunteering, that through their work, that the tourists and the tourism sector are benefiting from preserved landscapes and sites, upgraded tracks, protected wildlife, and so on. And while the events sector has been particularly hard hit by the current alert level restrictions, the events sector and non-profit visitor attractions are hugely supported by bands of dedicated volunteers. And I can't miss a shout out to a programme I've been involved in, the Wellington City Ambassador Programme, which for over almost a decade has been a group of local community members who've been meeting and greeting visitors to the city. And I'd like us to think about how we can build on these initiatives to further engage communities in volunteering as an ambassadors for tourism. Next slide, please, Christian. Now, Chris has talked about work, so I'll just touch on that very briefly. But again, thinking about workers and how they act as ambassadors for their communities. Recent Statistics New Zealand data showed the impact of tourism job losses has disproportionately affected Māori and particularly Māori women's jobs in tourism. There's also been a significant drop in hours worked, and coupled with low weekly earnings in tourism, it's a significant concern. So as we think about cultivating communities as ambassadors, we also need to think about resetting tourism so that it provides meaningful and decent work in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 8. This is about making and promoting tourism as a desirable sector to work in and a first choice career, not just a job. It can include positioning the positives of tourism work, but also thinking about decent work that recognises the value of soft skills and emotional intelligence and rewards them appropriately. And that leads me on to my fourth and final aspect of communities as ambassadors for tourism. This is communities as lifelong learners and investing in education and training as a lifelong commitment. I'm part of a relatively new group called Tourism Educators Forum Aotearoa. And with this, we're working with educators across the secondary schools and the public and private tertiary sector to work with industry and government to challenge and change the perceptions of tourism work in education and to recognise the value of investing in training and education. We need to see communities value the opportunities to learn about tourism and develop skills that will enable New Zealanders to offer the world-class visitor experience as tourism re-emerges. Now more than ever, we need that educated and trained workforce to contribute and lead to that post-COVID tourism industry that will be central to New Zealand's economic and social recovery. And it's not just about young people here and businesses that need to invest. All our whānau, the mums, the dads, the aunties and the uncles really need to recognise the value of tourism education and training and support those who want to pursue a worthwhile career in tourism. And actually this down period, as Chris has touched on, is actually a really important opportunity for individuals, communities to invest in upskilling and human capital development. So in conclusion, while many of our communities already support tourism, we can't take this for granted, and we have a real opportunity to think more mindfully about how we can positively engage our communities and harness their support as domestic tourists, workers, volunteers and learners, and really nurture them as tourism ambassadors who can recognise the opportunities that tourism can bring. Kia ora koutou, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much also to Karen. Clearly there are some themes running through all three presentations, which I think is actually a real synergy, because it does connect the different perspectives and the different voices. And obviously, I think a lot of the motivation comes out of a similar desire to see changes. So now we have about 15 minutes, well, 13 minutes now, to open for Q&A. And before everything gets a bit rushed at the end, I would also just like to take the opportunity to say thank you to Ian for pulling all of this together and for getting the speakers on board, and Abby and Colette, who have done a lot of the preparation to make these webinars possible. And they have reached extensive audiences around the world over the last 3 months. So they have really been a great way to connect. And if any of you are in Wellington post-COVID-19, do pop by. All right, now over to the questions. We'll start with the first question that was put to Freya from Share Nights, who says, thanks Freya, how do you see this approach, so socializing tourism, as different from regenerative tourism? Over to you, Freya.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Cher, for that question. I'm interested in regenerative tourism because it moves us beyond sustainability. But what I'm talking about is a very strong reorientation in tourism to not define it by the tourist or the tourism industry, but instead define it by local community rights, benefits, and interest, and continual opportunity to give consent to things that are occurring in their place. So regenerative tourism asks to turn tourism to ensuring that it improves the places in which it occurs. But in my view, it still centers tourism as the priority rather than saying tourism serves the local community. So I think that what I'm saying is a very strong new concept and a reorientation in our way of seeing things.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add anything to that? Although obviously it's not the concept that you have proposed, but in case there are any thoughts, I'm happy to add them now. Alternatively, we will move on to the next one, which comes from Johan Edelman from Japan. And he, I suppose, asks a very similar question. So I would have to call on you again, Freya, to defend against, is this different? When looking at socializing tourism, I can see that the ethos it carries is a continuation of sustainable, eco-responsible, or community-based tourism. Is there not a risk that people will see this as just a new brand of concerned tourism, which again might be misused, misappropriated by tourism boosters? So I suppose a different angle, not so much on the concept, but how it is being perceived by the various audiences.
Yes, thank you, Johan, for that comment. The fact is the tourism industry really doesn't want to engage with things that change the way that it makes its profits. So we have to be clear that some of the corporate tourism industry's model is about exploiting people and places and cultures to make money. And that's why we have the problem with over-tourism in places like Venice, where there's an extractive model and tourism is imposed upon communities for that. And yet all that time they'll be using the language of responsibility. You know, the cruise ship industry claims that it's one of the most responsible forms of tourism possible, which I find really astounding with what I accounted before. So yes, the tourism industry and tourism supporters, boosters, will try to co-opt any of these concepts. The UN World Tourism Organization is using the words of transformation at the moment. But the integrity of what I'm saying is a very, very different way of approaching things. The question that comes to challenge me, and Karen and Chris can definitely pose this in their own work, is how practical is this? You know, I've had questions about exactly which communities are we talking about, because there are factions within communities. And we do have things like the tourism workers. But I do think that the pressure that we're seeing on complaints about tourism are essentially the fact that communities are disempowered by tourism being imposed upon them. Karen's view of communities as ambassadors is a beautiful example of what could be done. And the only place I have a disagreement with Karen is that tourism is the priority rather than the community and its interest being the priority. So it's a difference of emphasis in our views.
Wonderful. Now, clearly you're not known to disagree with anyone, Freya, but it's good to get a little bit of spike in there. Karen, would you like to respond to that? Before, I would like to put out a question about education and workforce development.
Well, I think I really like, Freya, I've covered a page of notes from your presentation, and I really like what you were talking there around kind of where the emphasis goes. And one of the sort of the words I highlighted, partly because I found it really hard to say, is see, I can't say it. A reciprocal relationship here. And I think for me, that kind of sort of sums up actually the two bookends of today's webinar, that actually that we're both talking about the idea of a relationship that is actually beneficial for both. And the emphasis is in slightly different spaces, but in both cases, it's about not exploiting in either direction. And I think that's really kind of the big change that both of us are actually asking for, perhaps demanding, is that this is not a one-way relationship, that we actually need to look at this so that this is more mutually beneficial. And that's really hard, because I think you're completely right, Freya, that this is not how the sector has developed in its huge growth period. And actually at the moment, I think it's probably a wake-up call that is not, that is actually really valuable to have in many ways, despite all the challenges it's creating, that it actually opens up questions and debates that have been really hard to get to the forefront. And I know a lot of your work, you know, these are not new things that Freya is talking about, but actually what they're doing is being listened to in a different way, because we have an opportunity to rethink tourism. And I think that we really need to grasp that opportunity, because there's only a small window, I think, in terms of that space where we can actually think. So yeah, thank you really much for prompting those ideas, Freya.
Thank you, Karen and Freya. And I would, we do have a couple of other questions, but I just want to throw something out there about what this means for us as educators. There will clearly be members of industry and general society in the audience, but there will also be educators. So Chris, over to you. What does that mean for us as educators? Maybe standing in the classroom, maybe sitting in front of a computer, however we now engage with our students. So the next generation, how do we do our job well?
Thank you, Christian. I was actually thinking about the responses that we've just had and the issue about socializing tourism. And Freya, you spoke to over-tourism. We've been involved in the issue of over-tourism in Pāta for some time. We don't particularly want to call it over-tourism. We want to refer to it as something more along the lines of a management issue with tourism. But the reality is that where we see all the issues is where we reach thresholds, and thresholds of community acceptance of tourism and of the impact it has on the communities. It's this term threshold is an important one, because it's very interesting that in different economic contexts, that threshold is completely different. You see a very different threshold in these highlighted cases of Venice and Barcelona and Madrid than you do in Hanoi or Beijing or Bangkok, where there is not the same kind of social organization, or the same kind of community-based organization, the same kind of resources available to do the management that you're talking about. So we have to be careful in the context of educators, Christian, that we're not too altruistic, that we're actually quite practical and realistic about the fact that jobs are jobs and people need jobs. And we have to find this very difficult balance of making sure that people have incomes in these different situations. There are a range of different ways that we can, frameworks we can use to educate and educate in the right way. One that comes to mind, and it again speaks to the socializing context, is human rights as a framework in which we can actually look at how tourism should be developed. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, for example, has a remarkable framework in which we've actually utilized this in some research we've done with Pāta. We've looked at human rights and Indigenous communities and tried to use that as a framework to actually make sure that the impacts on communities are not profound, but they are respectful, and so on and so forth. So where I'm getting to with all of this is that as educators, we've got a lot of different frameworks. It is our responsibility to share this, to try and build the critical thinking knowledge that is so essential to then be able to apply to all these different circumstances. And how this works in each different context is there are always tools, but the fundamental is critical thinking, is problem solving, is cognitive, deep learning about the different issues, and then how do we find solutions. But we have to be pragmatic. This is an industry of jobs, and it's an industry of people making a living. And we have to be respectful of people's need to make a living and find out how to accomplish that for everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Did either Karen or Freya want to respond to Chris's points? Yep, Freya.
I'd love to, Christian. I hear your words to be pragmatic, and I've heard this on TriNet on the debate over the war on tourism, and I responded to that with an article about the war over tourism as a result of it. And I'm concerned that in saying we need jobs, we're not looking at the issue of the fact that often in tourism, we've accepted the fact that the jobs are poorly paid, that they limit people in the skills and the promotion levels that they can attain, and that often people are forced into this. I found really great analysis from a Native American scholar in the US that talked about Indigenous tourism as mutually arranged exploitation, saying that Indigenous communities are so desperate for economic opportunities that they allow tourism to exploit them, and they become agents in their own exploitation. So that's my critique of some of these things. So I hear you, but I'd really like to see one of our things in our education that's emphasized is caring and empathy, so that we'd say it is not acceptable that a person cannot make a living off of one job in tourism and hospitality. And that's what we tolerate in this, is we say that some people aren't worth paying properly and ensuring that they're not precarious. And we're not limiting the things like the gig economy and the desperation, because with the COVID pandemic, what we've actually seen is that most of the countries around the world can take care of their citizens if they choose to do so. So we actually create these systems of economies and societies that are built upon exploitation, and then tourism takes advantage of it. That's my view. But in agreeing with you, I agree totally, Chris, with the things we need in tourism education, but I'd add caring and empathy on top of that. Thank you.
If I could, I would just like to say I totally agree with you on that too. I think we're at a really interesting phase where we do have this opportunity of a reboot. How do we do it better? We just have to also be cognizant of the fact that it's there's a lot of people hurting out there, and we know we know those people, and we know the changes that they're going through in their employment right now. It's a tough time, so we have to be thinking about, you know, how do we cater to, how do we accomplish a reboot, possibly in a better way. And when you ask about what we can do as educators, we've got frameworks to do this, but we also have to build those skill sets so people can excel. And that environment is shifting. And that was the point I was trying to make in my presentation. So it's an interesting and challenging time for all of us.
Thank you very much. There are some other interesting questions that I would encourage the speakers to look at. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but just because Doug Pierce is in the audience, there's a question for you, Chris. Is there a future for tour coach drivers? You have one.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last piece of the question, but I did hear about the tour coach drivers. Well, Doug, I think you have to ask that question yourself. Was there a future for tour coach drivers? Hopefully there was. I think in reality, that's changing though. So I don't know the answer to that one, but I hope there are more in the future. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks. I think we might have VR headset operators in the future who can do a similar job. It's a bit of a cheeky suggestion. Thank you very much to all three speakers. It's been wonderful to have this opportunity to continue the conversation that we started back in June, when it feels like the world was a different place and we were still talking about the first waves and not the second waves and maybe the third waves. So clearly this thing is going to hang around for longer than anticipated. All these wonderful thoughts are much appreciated. I would like to say thank you to Freya, Chris, and Karen, and also to all those who posted questions. As usual, we will summarize the questions, and the video recording of the seminar will be made available via the website. So thank you very much, and ka kite.